in expressing our condolences to the family and loved ones of those who were lost. These kinds of things are stunning and happen so quickly and remind us how precious every single day is that we have here. So I would ask all of you to join in a moment of silence as we say a prayer and remember those who went before and especially their families. Okay, with that, we'll proceed to committee business meeting script. We have before us the nominations of Elise Stefanik to be U.S. Ambassador to the UN and U.S. Representative to the UN Security Council and General Assembly. Is there a motion to favorably report the nominations? Is there a second? It's been moved and seconded that we proceed to send these to the floor with a recommendation that they be confirmed by the floor. So, is there debate? There being no debate,
Mr. Chairman, I intend to vote for Congresswoman Stefanik. I was particularly appreciated her response to my question about UNFPA and her willingness to review that because UNFPA does 3 times more work for women and children around the world than we do through our bilateral relationships. I don't agree with all of Representative Stefanik's positions, but I was pleased to hear her talk about her interest in supporting the work of the UN and trying to ensure that it operates better, and so I intend to support her.
Thank you very much. Is there further debate? Yeah, Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a close call for me. I was inclined to vote for Elise Stefanik for UN Ambassador, but I frankly, as the days have unfolded, have become more and more alarmed at the scope and reach of the impact of the freeze on funding for activities for USAID around the world, and have said I'm not going to vote for nominees until this is reversed. And in her confirmation hearing in response to a question from Senator Schatz, she said she supported it. I hope we can still work together and she will represent us well, but I will vote against her, really more in protest of that particular action.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Is there further debate?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Schatz.
I'm going to vote for her. It's also a close call. I'm going to vote for her because I told her I was going to vote for her, and my word is my bond. But I'm in a similar place to Senator Coons, and I do think there's been bipartisan support for helping Secretary Rubio to clarify the foreign aid freeze. But just so everybody understands, money is not flowing. The Secretary is saying the right things, and that implementation memo as amended is helpful, but on the ground in the places where 5 days ago we were describing medicine spoiling at the dock, clinics being closed, people being furloughed, the Secretary's amended memo has not effectuated the change that we are expecting it to, and so we really just on a nonpartisan basis, on a bipartisan basis, have to keep the pressure on the State Department to effectuate the Secretary's policy, because right now there's a ton of confusion and these are faraway places, and the original stop work orders are still being observed in some places and not in others. The furloughs are in some places being undone and not in others, and this is not some policy question anymore. It's a question of executing what the Secretary has asked. So I just ask that we continue to put pressure on a bipartisan basis, and just to understand the urgency of the moment. 4 days ago, I asked, now how bad is this? And they said, babies dying by the weekend. And so this is not the kind of thing that we can get back to on Monday. We all have to exert pressure and make sure that the State Department gets this right, and I'm talking about in the next 24 hours.
Thank you very much, Senator. I have spoken to Secretary Rubio on numerous occasions, starting the end of last week, on this subject due to input from all of you, from the media, from everyone else. This is obviously a work in progress. It was intended to underscore the fact that we're going into debt at the rate of $1 trillion every 100 days. I think that has certainly been underscored as a result of this. If you think this is bad, when our debtors come and want their money and we can't pay it, that's going to be really bad. And so it's caused everyone to take a breath and look at how we're spending our money, where we're spending our money, seeing that it's done as efficiently as possible. Admittedly, there have been some inconveniences along the line, but they're continuing to work on this, and I think everyone is committed. All of us know Secretary Rubio well, and he is committed to make this work. Senator Shaheen.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that. I think you and other members of this committee who I've talked to have expressed their concerns about it. But I will tell you that I resent hearing, not from Secretary Rubio, but from other members of the administration, that the only people who care about these issues are Democrats, and this is a Democrat versus Republican issue. I don't happen to believe that. I've been on this committee, as have you, since I got to the United States Senate, and I believe that most of us are on this committee because we understand how important what we do around the world is to our own national security here. And I hope that all of you on the other side of the aisle will share your concerns with the administration and point out that this is not a partisan issue. This is about what are we going to do to ensure that our influence continues around the world in the interest of our own national security. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, and I agree with you. This is certainly not a partisan issue, and neither is the other side of the coin, and that is the debt that we're going in. I know that you all share the same views that we do, that this is the biggest challenge to national security that there is, really, is the internal debt that we're gathering at the rate of $1 trillion every 100 days. We are in agreement that neither one of these issues are partisan issues, but we're all Americans, and we've got to get through these. Yes, Senator.
Mr. Chairman, I will be voting no. I'm very concerned about the point of view that the nominee expressed regarding Israel's right to the entire West Bank. I think there have been such an unleashing of attacks on Palestinian settlements in the West Bank, and that this viewpoint perpetuates a cycle of war and hate, and is exactly the wrong approach for us to have an enduring peace and stability that will free the next generation from dealing with the same conflicts we're dealing with now.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I will oppose this nomination for the reasons Senator Coons mentioned, but also because I think that Ms. Stefanik is the wrong person for this job at the United Nations. If you look at her record in the House, she voted to terminate U.S. funding for the UN. On one occasion, she voted against funds to the United Nations. On another, she apparently didn't vote. So her current position, which is that she thinks the United States should fully engage at the UN, which I agree with, seems to be a nomination Eve conversion. She also supports the president's decision to withdraw from the World Health Organization, which is going to simply cede that ground to China. And I also am opposing this nomination because I was very troubled by the witnesses' response to questions I asked regarding the situation in the Middle East that Senator Merkley has identified. Her answers are way out of the mainstream of American bipartisan foreign policy for years, and will make it impossible to achieve any kind of light at the end of this dark tunnel that we find ourselves in if she continues to hold those views. And my view is she cannot be effective at the UN with the positions she's taken.
Further debate? There being no further debate, we'll proceed to a vote. Are we satisfied with a voice vote with people registering a no, or do you want a roll call vote? If there's no objection, we'll do a voice vote. All in favor of the two nominations for Ms. Stefanik, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay? Nay. And senators wish to be recorded. Senator Van Hollen. Senator Merkley, Senator Coons will be recorded as noes. Thank you very much. Appreciate the cooperation. And with that,
Mr. Chairman?
Yep, I'm sorry.
I've also received some requests from members who wish to be recorded as no, and so we will submit them to the clerk.
That's without objection. Those will be entered. With that, the business meeting will be adjourned, and we'll proceed to our hearing on PRC malign influence at home and abroad. So with that, I want to welcome our witnesses here today, and want to thank you for being here today, for taking your time to help us explore this important topic. This is the first policy hearing in this Congress. We felt it important to focus on the greatest long-term threat to the United States, that being China. As both a public official and a private citizen, I've watched the Chinese government's malign influence grow. Their political games, economic schemes, and military aggression has only increased over the years. The Chinese Communist Party has worked diligently to bring China to what it is today, and it did it the old-fashioned way. Chinese officials bribed, stole, and cheated at every opportunity to ensure that China comes out on top. And we let them do it virtually uninhibited. This has to stop. I think all of us agree the threat of Chinese influence on Western society is very real and needs to be addressed. The same Chinese government that commits genocide against its ethnic minorities and dramatically oppresses the God-given freedoms of its people also attempts to influence America. As we speak, they are working to undermine our national security, our economy, and our values. And it is doing the same to our allies. This isn't just wrong, but most of all, it is dangerous. Chinese influence spans industries, from government to academia, from research laboratories to farms and factory floors. No matter where, the Chinese government is determined to use both our people and our institutions to achieve China's political, economic, and military objectives. China interferes in elections around the world, including in the United States. It skirts foreign lobbying laws to influence democratic governments. And it woos state and city officials with elegant trips to adopt pro-China policies in an effort to pressure federal government. It is no secret that the Chinese government conducts espionage on American soil, but China goes far beyond this. China siphons American technology and intellectual property from companies it partners with, repurposing it for their own economic benefit and riding on the back of American ingenuity. China pumps money into American universities and think tanks attempting to secure access to sensitive military technology. Despite these threats, the previous administration just renewed a science and technology agreement that actually encourages the very collaboration that could provide China with more access. Abroad, our allies face similar problems, often on a larger scale. China co-ops international organizations like the UN and ensures they never get a chance to address the many human rights atrocities and military incursions China commits. Sadly, while the Chinese government has improved and redefined its tactics over the year, U.S. diplomatic tools and laws have not kept pace to help manage these problems. My goal today is to begin outlining what this committee can do to push back on China's political, economic, and military influence in our country and abroad. To start, I hope that we can close the loopholes that allow for foreign agents to lobby government officials, reform our visa process to screen those who pose an intelligence risk, and encourage our national security community to play a larger role to counter the Chinese influence in American universities. This work will take a whole-of-government approach, but in large part will be spearheaded by Secretary Rubio. I know Secretary Rubio will use state as more than just a diplomatic mouthpiece, as has been the case. I know he will operate the State Department as the United States government's expert agency on fighting foreign influence and incorporate countering Chinese influence into every aspect of its mission. The Chinese will use every trick they can come up with to undermine America and other freedom-loving nations. But working together across the aisle, across branches of government, and with our allies across oceans, America has and always will beat our authoritarian aggressors. And I have no doubt that we will continue to do so. With that, I will yield to Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to each of our witnesses. Thank you all for being here today. I certainly think Chairman Risch has made some important points that I agree with. We've worked closely together on the Chinese Communist Party's, the CCP's malign activities in the past, activities like supporting Taiwan and Lithuania that we've worked together on in the face of Beijing's economic coercion, voting to protect America's user data from being captured by the CCP on TikTok. I think these concerns, as are so many of the concerns about China, very bipartisan. Just last week at our hearing, senators from both sides of the aisle highlighted the danger posed by China's efforts at the United Nations. Today, China is targeting and exploiting open societies with every tool that they have. They leverage corrupt investments over decision makers in Africa and Latin America. They've tried to buy off politicians in Australia and New Zealand to undermine democratic elections. They control strategic ports in places like Sri Lanka and Piraeus in Greece. And they conduct covert espionage against American industries from advanced science to aerospace to AI. Given the stakes, I hope each of you today will share recommendations that we can take as policymakers. Something that I really want to zero in on is the growing cooperation between Beijing and Moscow. At the summit here in Washington last year, NATO labeled China a decisive enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine. But as we've seen, this partnership goes both ways. Russia has a lot to teach China when it comes to disinformation campaigns. Even before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia's Ministry of Digital Development, Communication, and Mass Media was partnering with China's National Radio and Television Administration. So when Russia published lies about biolabs in Ukraine, the Global Times, a Chinese Communist Party outlet, picked up the story. And last year, we saw Russia and China working together to spread disinformation and to destabilize the Solomon Islands. The Global Times amplified stories from the Russian state-controlled media agency Sputnik, saying the U.S. was seeking I'm quoting here, a democratic transition by violent means in the Solomon Islands. Before our diplomats could refute these allegations, the waters had already been muddled to Beijing and Moscow's benefit. China's leaders have made shaping global and local public opinion a priority. They've bought up entire foreign media companies located outside China to promote pro-Beijing propaganda around the world. They've also targeted fact-based journalists with The New Yorker, The Economist, The New York Times, The Guardian, and others. And in many of the worst instances, they've gone after female journalists of Asian descent with harassment, trolling, and threats. Chinese diaspora and human rights groups are also targets. According to The New York Times, they not only attacked a writer living outside Philadelphia who criticized Xi Jinping, they also posted sexually explicit and threatening comments against his teenage daughter. Beijing has used these tactics on its own population at home, and it's refined them for export abroad. Taken together, these malign actions are a threat to the United States. And our efforts, sadly, in the information space have not been very effective. The Foreign Malign Influence Center made strides against China and Russia in their attempts to undermine U.S. presidential elections. But Congress' failure to extend the Global Engagement Center last year, I believe, was a serious setback for the State Department's ability to counter disinformation and propaganda. China is spending billions of dollars to amplify Russian propaganda, and we need more tools like the Global Engagement Center, not fewer. Of course, as former ambassador to China Nick Burns said when I met with him recently on his way home from his ambassadorship, when it comes to how the U.S. responds to China, the devil is in the details. I am deeply concerned by the administration's stop work order and foreign aid freeze, actions that can only lead to human suffering and endanger our national security. They undermine America's credibility, and they give an opening to countries like China and Russia, who are very happy to fill the void that we leave. So I look forward to hearing from each of you today on how we should think about tackling this complex problem. How can we best defend our transparent, democratic nation from China's malign influence? How do we position the United States for a future that benefits all Americans. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. We'll now proceed to our witnesses who we're going to hear from today. And let me say, first of all, that the issue, as we've just heard, is not a partisan issue, but one that, as far as the problem is concerned, we're very much in agreement on. We have a really distinguished panel here today. We worked together on a bipartisan basis to put this panel together. We're going to hear from some people who are very schooled in this issue and will be helpful to us and to the American people. So we'll take them one at a time, and I'll start with Mr. Peter Mattis. He is president of the Jamestown Foundation. He's a leading expert on the Chinese Communist Party and its United Front system, and has previously worked on these issues in the Senate, the House of Representatives, and the intelligence community, and elsewhere. Mr. Mattis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Risch. Thank you, Senator Shaheen, and all the other distinguished senators that are here for drawing attention to this important issue, because awareness and expertise are two of the key factors in being able to respond and to protect this country and also protect other democracies and other countries that are standing up to protect their sovereignty and standing. The Chinese Communist Party's influence activities can loosely be formed in the umbrella of United Front work. These can be described best as efforts to monitor, control, and mobilize individuals, institutions, platforms, and other civil society organizations outside the CCP to work on the party's behalf. So I think to put this into kind of a context for you, it would be that if you guys maintained your campaign infrastructure in your state and then kept putting a committee into every company, into every Elks Club, Kiwanis, every school, every university, every research institute, a national lab if it's there, that would be kind of like what United Front work is. It keeps moving out to make those institutions serve the party's political purpose. And describing it in that context, I think, should make it clear why this is not something where we should describe interference or influence, but this is actually a tool that is pernicious and undermining the very functioning of institutions. United Front is also a way of looking at politics. It's a very clear calculation by the party of who are our enemies, who are our friends, and how do we mobilize those friends? How do we recruit neutrals to isolate our enemies, to strike them, and to make them ineffective? It's also a huge policy bureaucracy. Now, sometimes people say there's the United Front Work Department, but which one? The central one, the 31 provincial ones, the 300 municipal ones, the thousands of county level ones, or the ones in companies, the ones in the China Academy of Sciences and the China Academy of Social Sciences? Which ones are we referring to? This is a system that engages hundreds of thousands of people very directly inside the party, on the fringes of the party, and it keeps extending outward. The CCP's United Front sees United Front as a tool to achieve its objectives of national rejuvenation. And that national rejuvenation can sort of broadly be defined as one, comprehensive modernization, the second, unification. Now, we think of this in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, but it's really a political, economic, social, and cultural unification. It's not just having control, and it's putting everything together. The primary targets of United Front work are those individuals and institutions and platforms that really make democracy work. Their social groups, their media, their universities, their local and national political leaders, their companies. Anything that can be leveraged by the party will be leveraged. What is the harm, if you will? The first is that in some cases, when an organization is taken over by the party, our own citizens lose their voice to speaking to their own elected representatives in their own government, right? Because you can't possibly meet every one of your constituents. You rely on these groups to tell you what is going on in your state, in districts if you were in the House. But if that community organization leader is someone who's speaking for the party, you might think that you're hearing from someone who's representing 500 people or 1,000 people. But really, it's somebody who's representing the CCP rather than their fellow Americans. And you can go down a list of things, that the distortion of the marketplace of ideas, the loss of technology, as Mr. Stoff will cover, the facilitation of intelligence operations. Pushing back necessarily requires sort of insider information of institutions and organizations that are being affected, and that person needs awareness. They need something like a hearing today or other types of information, whether it's RFA reporting abroad or any other form of, say, a report from Safeguard Defenders or other civil society organizations to say, wait a minute, there's a problem here, and I can go out and find external expertise, which is the next piece. You need external expertise. And one of the ways in which the United States is very different than the CCP is that we support people who are trying to stand up for their own rights, for their own countries, for their own sovereignty. And the party is paying people to do their own bidding, that of the CCP, and not for the benefit of their citizens and fellows. And lastly, you need political power. As when I worked with Senator Cruz's staff in 2018 to keep the CCP out of the University of Texas, Austin, it took someone who was on the inside, it took the outside expertise, and then it took someone who was willing to draw attention to it and say there are political consequences for this. So to get through this, in terms of recommendations, anything that improves transparency, such as FAR reform, to make things more accessible, to make sure that it's not a quarterly update, that it's searchable, would be beneficial. There's focus on the Chinese Malign Influence Fund, like keeping it strategic rather than just repurposing funds for existing programs. And I think it's worth thinking about what are the ways to incentivize action within executive departments, such as the Department of State, so that we're asking Congress or asking the State Department to report when authorities are not used, rather than sort of trying to avoid the congressional reporting requirement of many things that are put forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mattis. We'll turn now to Mr. Jeffrey Stoff. He is the founder of the Center for Research, Security, and Integrity. He previously spent nearly 2 decades in government focused on risks to the security and integrity of research from adversarial or authoritarian nations. He now advises academia, governments, and businesses on these matters. Mr. Stoff, the floor is yours.
Chairman Risch, Ranking Member Shaheen, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on this critically important topic. Now that I no longer work in the government, I can speak very candidly about the PRC's method to exploit our innovation ecosystem and the failures within both the government and academia to address this problem. Over the last 15 years, I've studied China's research ecosystem and how the party state exploits our innovation. I worked closely with most federal agencies that fund scientific research, as well as law enforcement and intelligence components. That support has exposed me to a range of deficiencies and failures of the U.S. government, which were a source of my frustration and the reason I resigned from federal service in 2021. Today, neither academia nor governments of liberal democracies has sufficiently adapted to a contradictory reality. One of the most significant participants in the global scientific enterprise is also our greatest adversary, an extremely oppressive regime that seeks to dominate and displace the U.S. technologically and militarily, to reshape the world order and to preserve the Communist Party's interests. It is past time to have candid and uncomfortable conversations about the current state of how the PRC's unfettered access to our research ecosystem and its malign influence activities have profound effects on our national and economic security and the corrupting and corrosive effects that are enabled by the negligence of U.S. partners. U.S. universities are run like businesses with a primary objective of generating revenue. Academia's incentives are often not aligned with U.S. national security and economic interests. Systemic noncompliance on federal research grants and its willingness to accept and fail to report PRC sources of funding often run counter to the values of transparency and integrity that academia espouses. My written testimony shows examples of academia's widespread disregard for security of ethical concerns. I provide low estimates of over 27,000 articles published just in the past 5 years, involving collaboration between U.S. institutions and PLA medical entities, weapons design and production facilities, state-owned defense enterprises that supply the PLA, key defense research universities, and entities that develop and deploy mass surveillance technologies to PRC public security organs, enabling human rights abuses. Much of this research is funded by federal agencies, private foundations, and corporate sponsors with few restrictions or regulatory oversight. The U.S. government has done little to deter academia from failing to comply with federal research grant rules, such as failing to disclose PRC money and support, which sometimes appear to be an attempt to disguise contracted research for the PRC as unrestricted gifts. This, combined with PRC programs that task and incentivize U.S. faculty members to bypass merit-based hiring decisions, conduct research projects at the PRC's behest, and a swath of other malign activities, create corrosive secondary effects as well. These include a vicious cycle of inequity in the system, Smaller schools that are being honest but denied federal funding have smaller budgets and fewer resources to hire PhD students, attract top talent, etc., which then makes them less competitive on future grant proposals. This also translates to fewer opportunities domestically and an erosion of STEM talent pipelines. Compounding these problems are abject failures by the FBI's near-exclusive focus on criminal investigations as a hammer looking for a nail that fails to protect earlier stages of our research ecosystem, as well as the intelligence community's failure to adapt to post-Cold War realities and the asymmetric threats posed by China, which only seldom involve espionage activities. The scale and scope of China's predations in our research ecosystem are largely unknown, making it impossible to determine the level of influence the PRC exerts over our U.S. research that overwhelmingly benefits China. My testimony discusses issues that go beyond the jurisdiction of this committee. My recommendations seek to close regulatory gaps and bolster compliance and enforcement mechanisms, and have State Department play a much larger role in many of these areas to ensure that real costs are imposed to the PRC when it violates commonly accepted norms and values of scientific research. To effectively counter the PRC's malign influence, we must find the courage to break down silos and build new paradigms for cooperation among and between federal agencies, legislative committees, and our key allies and partners around the world. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. We'll now hear from Dr. Melanie Hart. She is the Senior Director of the Global China Hub at the Atlantic Council. Immediately prior, she served at the Department of State and played a central role on U.S. responses to Chinese economic coercion, as well as strategy and international engagement on semiconductors. Dr. Hart, the floor is yours.
Senator Risch, Ranking Member Shaheen, distinguished members of this committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The U.S. and China are engaged in systemic competition. It is a competition over which model prevails, the U.S. model of political and economic development or China's. If China prevails, the U.S. and the world will be less free, less prosperous, and less safe. Beijing is deploying a range of tactics to achieve its objectives. Some constitute traditional diplomacy. Some constitute malign influence. The State Department must be empowered to fight on both fronts. I would like to make 5 key points. First, showing up in the traditional diplomatic arena is foundational to America's success. Our diplomats must be resourced to show up and pull every lever to advance U.S. national interests. When they do, they win. In 2020, China held 4 of the 15 leadership roles across the UN specialized agencies. Today, Beijing is down to just 1. The department made those positions a priority, starting with the International Telecommunication Union. The department identified and ran compelling candidates and launched a whole-of-department effort to rally the votes needed to win. Diplomacy works. Second, when combating malign influence, transparency is our superpower and Beijing's kryptonite. Beijing knows the China model is deeply flawed. That is why Beijing resorts to malign influence. It relies on information control to hide the costs associated with the China option and coercion to force others to bear those costs. Examples include engaging in widespread graft to sway foreign official decisions in Beijing's favor, filing libel suits against PRC critics to silence them, engaging in economic coercion, in disinformation, and electoral interference. Boosting transparency should always be step 1 when combating malign influence. These tactics are covert by design, so exposure often neutralizes them. Third, the global information space is an active battlefield that impacts every arena of U.S.-China competition. Beijing engages in information warfare. It seeks to control information at home and abroad and use that control to advance its objectives at America's expense. The now shuttered State Department Global Engagement Center was the primary U.S. mechanism for combating China's information warfare. GEC enabled Washington to broadcast its own messages to the global public, sharing our vision and exposing the truth about China's. GEC was not just a government megaphone. It provided grants to third-party researchers around the world, empowering an entire global army of counter-malign influence warriors to combat CCP disinformation. That is why the Chinese Foreign Ministry has referred to GEC as Washington's command center of perception warfare. I urge Congress to reauthorize the Global Engagement Center. Keeping these counter-influence warriors off the battlefield boosts Beijing at America's expense. Fourth, economic coercion requires active defense. During the Biden administration, the department launched an internal unit to provide support to nations facing Chinese economic coercion. That effort was wildly successful. So much so, it neared case capacity due to the number of nations coming in for assistance. At present, there is no single State Department FTE or office with authorization and appropriations to counter Chinese economic coercion. I urge Congress to provide dedicated resources for this effort. Fifth, and finally, I would be remiss in my duty to this committee if I did not raise the current foreign assistance freeze, which is hobbling America's ability to compete with China in every domain. Over $1 billion in foreign military financing for Taiwan, frozen. NDI and IRI are shutting down global operations. Human rights organizations, frozen. Washington has effectively abandoned the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement. I understand the need to maximize strategic focus in foreign aid. I applaud Secretary Rubio's steps to lift some restrictions, but this broad freeze hobbles America at a moment when we are in the battle of the century. It is a massive gift to Beijing. The longer it goes on, the harder it will be to regain the ground we are already losing today, tomorrow, and this week. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hart. We'll now hear from Dr. Jennifer Lind. She is an associate professor of government at Dartmouth College. She also is a faculty associate at Harvard University and the author of a forthcoming book on the rise of China and future of great power competition. So with that, Dr. Lind, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Risch. Chairman, Ranking Member Shaheen, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for having me today. What I'd like to talk about is China's malign influence operations and influence operations more broadly. And let me talk about what these operations are and what makes them malign. Although all countries seek to build their influence through a range of policies that we call public diplomacy, malign influence operations are a very different matter. The CCP conducts extensive influence operations that are malign both in terms of goals and methods. Such operations seek to bolster authoritarianism, discredit democratic governance, reshape global norms in China's interest, and silence China's critics. In these operations, proxy organizations obscure ties to the CCP while they buy media companies and fund research and think tanks. Cyber units employ illegal cyber espionage and hacking operations, and Chinese agents coerce American citizens into promoting Beijing's interests by threatening their family back in China. China's influence operations are thus threatening because their goals run counter to U.S. interests and because of the covert and illegal methods on which they rely. Furthermore, they are threatening because they are massive in scope. They are run through a huge government bureaucracy consisting of numerous different agencies at all levels of society. The budget for these operations is said to exceed the budget of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This is not geopolitics as usual. This is an unusually aggressive and well-funded effort. Now, how should the U.S. respond to these malign operations? In my written statement, I introduced a framework for thinking about U.S. policy. Its goal is not only to defend the United States from hostile Chinese operations, but also to convince Beijing to rein in its activities, and thus to establish some rules of the road to stabilize our strategic competition. The first step toward creating those rules is for U.S. leaders to identify which of China's activities are regrettable but normal great power competition. For example, although we don't like it, and although we should maintain as good a defense as possible, we can probably tolerate cyber attacks, pro-CCP fake accounts on social media. But the second category of activities is different. These are the policies or behaviors that US leaders decide are intolerable. Such activities might include election interference, abductions, and operations that coerce American citizens. So step one is to distinguish between regrettable but tolerable operations versus intolerable ones. Step two is to develop a toolkit that we are willing to use to shape Chinese behavior, actions that the CCP would view as intolerable. The US government would convey privately to Beijing that if it violated the bounds of acceptable activities, we would respond in kind. That is, we would cross some of Beijing's red lines. This is not an escalation. It's how great powers establish the rules of the game. Beijing's bright red lines, the absolutely intolerables, relate to China's domestic stability. Specific policies would have to be figured out at the classified level. But once again, the core idea is not only to play defense, but to make the CCP feel the costs of its aggression and to encourage it to moderate its behavior. This sounds delicate and dangerous and hard, and it's actually harder. Let me conclude by noting that not only do we have to manage this challenging strategic competition with Beijing, but in that competition lurk potential dangers to the rights of millions of Americans, Chinese Americans in particular. Our adversary is already, at this early stage and in peacetime, coercing good Americans to work against their country on its behalf. As we formulate our responses to Chinese malign influence operations, US leaders should think about previous situations, such as World War II, Japanese internment, and Cold War McCarthyism, and think about when our institutions protected our people versus failed them. In other words, US leaders should think not only about this important strategic interaction with Beijing, but whether our policies in that interaction uphold our values. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. First of all, I want to commend the panel. We get panels through here all the time, but this is probably as good a presentation as we've had on an issue in a long, long time. Part of this whole problem is the fact that convincing America and different segments of America how dangerous of a situation this is. And one of the ones I've been focused on over the years and have been somewhat successful but not completely successful is to get a better handle on what colleges and universities are doing. The colleges and universities, as all of you know, are a really target-rich place for the Chinese. They show up with money, and as was pointed out here, colleges and universities respond to money, whether it's from their donors, from their alumni, or from the Chinese showing up with money. And most Americans are shocked to hear that we have hundreds of thousands of Chinese students studying here in the United States, with only a tiny, tiny fraction of U.S. students studying in China. And there's a huge difference. The Chinese students here are not studying ancient Greek history. They're here with the STEMs and the national security issues and everything else. And each and every one of them, whether they like it or not, is an agent of the Chinese Communist Party. When they go back, we all know they get debriefed, and any information that they've garnered here in the United States becomes the property of the Chinese Communist Party. So we've seen example after example of the Chinese showing up at a university, coming up with millions of dollars, and they get a chair, they get an endowed chair, they get an entire institution within the institution focused on what they want to have focused on. So I guess the question I'd have for all of you is, and first of all, admittedly, the universities have an entirely different view than we that work in the national security lane do of this. They when you sit down and talk with them, they're believe, and a lot of them I think are very sincere in their belief that, oh, in academia, we're all together, this is one big world, and we should all use this knowledge that we have and share it with each other, regardless of national security implications of it, whether it's designing computer chips or designing factories that manufacture arms. So give me some thoughts. How do we bring the universities on board to have a better understanding of, number one, how dangerous China is, and number two, how they are exploiting us, even without our knowledge in a lot of instances, in taking what we have? Mr. Mattis, let's start with you.
Well, one thing I can tell you is that 10 years ago, this was a completely different problem than it is today. There are actually resources, there are companies, there are more experts, there are journalists, there are plenty of places where universities can go. So a dearth of expertise or a lack of information is no longer the problem that they once faced, or it wasn't as severe. The second, as I think my friend Jeff has said, that the grant reporting requirements from the federal government actually have to be rigorously pursued and adhered to. We would consider it corruption if it were a defense contractor or others that were not providing the correct reporting requirements. And because, as I think you've heard from every single witness, the problem here is the corruption in the rules and the corruption of the process. And as long as that process is clear and it has rigor, then it will provide the basic level of protection. I think the other piece that's there is to go back into your home states and to talk to the public universities and engage them and ask, well, what have you done for compliance? What do you do about these things? Because I know from my time on Capitol Hill that those conversations actually did bear fruit, and they did drive public universities to think about
That's a good suggestion. Thank you. Mr. Stoff?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, a lot of it, I agree, a lot of it has to do with raising a level of understanding and awareness. And one of the challenges is that the U.S. government needs to share a lot more information on the kind of investigations. For example, the OIGs do a lot of interesting things that are at civil and administrative levels that don't reach, that are not just simply not public record, right? Because they're not a criminal indictment, and that's not a bad thing. But what happens is the universities are not seeing, and they're not really incentivized to see what's happening on their campuses and the type of malign influence and the way China can come in and divert and influence the research that's going on. There is some information that the government has that I think needs to do a much better job in sharing that. I think there also needs to be much more scholarship on the topic itself, where we demonstrate activities, behaviors that China exerts that is fundamentally against the principles and values of academic freedom, transparency, reciprocity, and integrity, which is core to what universities talk about of their mission. And there needs to be a lot more effort looking at where and how this is being done to show this is affecting us all, including on your campus, so that we take more collective action. Thank you.
Dr. Hart?
Thank you. I endorse the comments that have come before and would like to just add one point. We need a scalpel for this, not a sledgehammer. It is in U.S. national interest to keep the student pipeline open. We're in a pitched battle for global tech supremacy. For decades, Beijing stole our IP. Let's steal their best engineers. You know, China's national engineers developed the DeepSeek AI model that surprised the world this week. You know, we'd be better off if the engineers behind that were working here in the U.S., in U.S. universities and U.S. companies. So it's important to keep that in mind. Those student exchanges are a way that we can siphon off some of Beijing's top talent. So we want to make sure that for the students that are here, for the researchers that we want, that they feel they are safe in the United States, they understand how to follow the rules, and they feel their civil rights will be protected. Yeah, we can beat Beijing at making Chinese scientists feel safe.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hart. There's a flaw, however, in your suggestion, and I think probably everyone in the room knows it. When a student comes over here, they got to go back. If they don't go back, there's a family there, and we all know what the Chinese government does to families. They do it across the oceans, and they do it even here in the United States. So that's a great idea. The problem is we're dealing with a malign institution here. We're not dealing with people like Americans who say, oh, yeah, you're free to move and do whatever you want to do. They will take it out on the families. We've all heard stories of that. So, but you know, your thoughts are well taken. That it would be good if we could reverse the tables. I'm not so sure that we can do it in the same manner. My time's up, and Dr. Lynn, we'll get to you too again. We're going to do a 5-minute round, and if we got time, we'll back up. So, Senator Shaheen.
Well, thank you all. Let me echo the chairman on his appreciation for the presentation from everyone, and give a special shout out to Dr. Lynn from Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. We just have to get that in, Dr. Lynn.
Look at the time.
Senator Rubio, Secretary Rubio now, introduced a bill back in July of the last session that would have required the Secretary of State to work with the Ukrainian government to establish a mechanism for reviewing PRC investments in Ukraine. Now, sadly, one of the results of this foreign assistance freeze is that it's cutting off some essential services to Ukraine at a time when we know not only is Russia looking at how they can undermine Ukraine, but the PRC is starting to invest there. So if our goal is to prevent Ukraine from accepting that PRC investment, how does cutting off our own assistance move us toward that goal? And are there incentives for Beijing to play a productive role in trying to get to peace talks in that conflict? The president's raised that as a potential role for the PRC. Do we think that's likely? Dr. Lind.
Thank you for your question. On the broader issue of pausing U.S. foreign aid, I agree with the sentiments that we've heard today so far that talk about foreign aid as a really important arrow in the quiver of U.S. national security, along with other tools such as diplomacy, military assistance, and so on. And so ideally we would want to be using all of our different tools in a coordinated fashion to achieve our objectives. And so for that reason, I think it's understandable if the administration wants to take a short pause and assess, are we using the right tools in the right way? Should we be using some tools more than others, and so on? But we shouldn't be taking this important arrow out of our quiver. And we should recognize the many areas across the globe, talked about medicines going to waste on ports, talked about perhaps the politics of this leading to babies dying, right? So there's such direct things to think about here. So because of that, it's really important that we remember there's development assistance that this affects, and there's strategic realms that we may not have appreciated how consequential this would be, such as the conflict in Ukraine, for example.
So do we think, is there any incentive for the PRC to help move negotiations around the war in Ukraine? Does anybody on the panel think that there is a way that would encourage them to do that? Mr. Mattis?
So as president of the Jamestown Foundation, I oversee a large network of analysts that are not just covering China, but focus on Russia as well. And it's hard to see that the PRC has played any kind of neutral role. And even their positioning in peace talks has not been neutral. It has been reinforcing Russia's positions. And I can't help but think that at best, getting them to neutrality would require a lot of pressure and a lot of threats to their system that we can still apply. And the question is whether or not we would want to escalate in that way. But barring some massive change, Beijing is not neutral, and they've put their support behind Moscow. So anything there, they will try to bring pressure on Ukraine and to get Ukraine to surrender.
Thank you. Dr. Hart, as you pointed out in your comments, and I referenced in my opening statement, the PRC spends over $1 billion a year in promoting their messaging. They state-backed media outlets are found in every major hotel in the world. Chinese firms purchase local media outlets, and yet we are woefully behind. You mentioned the Global Engagement Center, also appropriations for U.S. agency for global media entities and networks, including Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe. Those have declined by almost 12% in real terms over the past decade. And as we all know, America has a better story to tell, but we need to be a lot better at telling it. So what should we think about other than those two arenas in terms of competing with China on their propaganda campaign?
Sure, I'll make 2 points. You know, China, as you said, is spending over $1 billion in getting its message out to the world. That's very difficult to combat directly. But one brilliant element of the former Global Engagement Center is that it provided grants to third parties in the United States and in other agencies to empower NGOs around the world to do their own investigations and their own exposure of what Beijing was actually up to. So it was a massive force multiplier. It enabled the United States to leverage voices around the world to combat Chinese disinformation. And that third-party element is really critical. And I would just add one other point, which is our online spaces. Unfortunately, we are seeing quite a bit of disinformation in social media and in other online spaces, which again, the U.S. government can be a bit slow in tackling those spaces, but there are third-party agencies that are great at it. The Atlantic Council has the Digital Forensic Research Lab, for example, which is actively tracking Chinese and Russian disinformation in U.S. and other social media domains. We want to empower not just the U.S. government, but also every ally we have in the field.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Sheen. Senator Ricketts.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists for being here today. Communist China is the single biggest external existential threat we have to our nation. I believe that you are all making the case for that this needs to be what we focus on, and we have not been focusing on it. And during his confirmation hearing, Secretary Rubio warned that, quote, if we stay on the road we're on right now, in less than 10 years, virtually everything that matters to us in life will depend on whether Communist China will allow us to have it or not. Folks, right now we're facing that first real test of whether or not we're willing to get off that road that we've been on that has allowed Communist China to take advantage of the world system and a country that seeks to displace us. And that test is TikTok. This app is just not another social media platform. It's one of the apps that Communist China uses in its web of diplomacy to push its propaganda, spy on Americans, and control the narrative of why they think they're better than we are. That's why we passed with bipartisan support a law that required ByteDance to sell within 270 days. And the Supreme Court, by the way, upheld that law unanimously. The law is now moved or is in effect, and so what you're seeing is TikTok has been removed from app stores, meaning that it means that not only can new users not download it, but you can't get updates, so effectively it will mean that the existing users will see their experience degrade as well. And as long as Communist China governed ByteDance controls the app, it is going to be a tool for the Communist Party in China to try to exercise its malign influence here in the United States. TikTok has 170 million users. 52% of them get their news from it. That's over 88 million Americans that rely on the app. And after October 7th, we saw that there were 50 times more downloads that were, or views that were more pro-Hamas, pro-Palestine than pro-Israel, despite the fact that polls show that Americans overwhelmingly supported Israel. And it's the TikTok is, we talked about controlling the narrative. China suppresses the information on there. So for example, I've seen different studies that show that, for example, if you compare TikTok and Instagram, there's 80 times more mentions of Tiananmen Square on Instagram versus TikTok. 180 times more mention of the Hong Kong protest when that was going on Instagram versus TikTok. 400 times the amount of content talking about Communist China being responsible for COVID on Instagram versus TikTok. And when it comes to Uyghurs, about 10 times more information on Instagram versus TikTok. This is part of how they are shaping the narrative. And it's just the start. And we see this in other applications as well. Obviously, with the announcement of the law going into effect on TikTok, Red Note saw a bunch of users. And of course, Dr. Hart, you just talked about DeepSeek as well. China's lining up the next apps to be able to control our things. And by the way, folks, we don't allow foreign adversaries or foreign companies to own our TV stations and radio stations. You're limited to 20% of direct foreign ownership in a TV or radio station. We don't have such laws for streaming services. That's one of the things perhaps we can take up. So these applications are where people are getting news in America. We have laws to block them in TV and radio stations, but not for applications like TikTok. Mr. Mattis, how relevant are these apps like TikTok to Communist China's strategy to control the narrative, to be in competition with us, to undermine us?
So one of the points that I alluded to in my statement and that Melanie has spoken about is that this narrative fight is actually not just a narrative on narrative, but it is a competition for the platforms and the pipes, if you will, that allow narratives to move and allow them to be pushed out. So if we go back, let's say 40 years to the Soviet disinformation effort to say that the United States was harvesting organs from babies in Latin America, or was the source of AIDS as a biological weapon in Africa. Those were things that took years and years of effort. And now those stories can be disseminated to 170 million people, essentially instantly and overnight. This is the biggest change. And I think we have to keep our eye focused on what those platforms are so that they can be free-flowing, that they're not distorted. Because to me, I know it's easy to understand the privacy issue of some of these apps, but it's the ability to distort the messages that people hear that are the most important. And everything that we've learned about cognitive psychology, the way that we take in information, the way our biases become anchored, right? The more closed off or the more you're sucked into a particular information source, the easier it is to plant something that will stick and it'll be harder to pull apart. So we have to keep our eye. I focus less on the narratives themselves and much more on the groups and the platforms. You know, it's first the medium, then the message is what the party's doing.
And if I may, Mr. Chairman, just real briefly, what should we do about Red Note and DeepSeek and other platforms like that?
I think for those kinds of platforms, you have to adopt the same approach that was applied to TikTok, that it either is sort of removed from the control or it is no longer available in the app stores.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Mattis. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to our panelists, and I agree with the Chairman. This is an excellent group to inform us. Mr. Mattis, I want to just start with the Philippines. As you know, they're one of our closest allies. We have economic assistance arrangements. We have life-saving support that we provide, and of course, we have a security partnership that's lasted generations. If you were a senior CCP official, how would you view this freeze in foreign aid coming from the United States?
Frankly, I would be looking to exploit the opportunity that is there. And over the years, the political fluctuations in the Philippines have offered those opportunities. They've disrupted the relationship, they've disrupted partnership, and anything from Beijing's perspective, or if I were a senior official in the United Front Work Department, I would be doing everything I can to exploit whatever chaos is there in the U.S.-Philippine relationship.
What would that look like?
Here are the sort of the traditional tools of sort of corruption. I would be looking also to mobilize groups to lobby politicians to say, well, look, the U.S. is an unreliable ally, and that you need to pull, you need to move in this other direction. I would be looking to create pressure about escalation risks if the Philippines chooses to defend itself, Second Thomas Shoal and other territories. It could go on a range of
Sure.
themes like that.
Do you think this moment is particularly important? I mean, it seems to me like tactically that if I were a senior CCP official, I would be mobilizing this week to be making some moves that are specific to the opportunity presented this week, not just as a general proposition in terms of great power competition in the Asia-Pacific region, but specifically to seize this opportunity of us looking like an unreliable partner. Is that fair to say?
When I look at the CCP, what I was alluding to was a long-term set of ambitions and clarity. And we may be talking about this more, but it doesn't mean that 10 years ago we didn't know or we didn't see these. It's just that we weren't looking.
No.
So there are always opportunities to exploit.
So let's go to Papua New Guinea. A lot of natural resources, but it's at risk of becoming a foothold for PRC military expansion. But right now it has the highest HIV incidence in the Pacific, and it's rising. It also has a lot of unexploded ordnance. And last year, the Department of Defense signed an $864 million defense deal with Port Moresby. So it seems to me that the Philippines is one question. We have a bilateral relationship that spans generations and is sturdy, like under Duterte, less sturdy, but still solid, even when we have a president who's an unreliable partner. But in places like PNG, where to use the domestic equivalent, they're sort of swing states. They're open for business, to being aligned with China, to being aligned with the United States, to playing both sides against the middle. I'm particularly concerned about smaller countries for whom withholding of economic or military or life-saving support is not something they can sort of weather. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about PNG in particular.
I don't know specifically about this, and I think it's the Secretary's job to determine how the priorities go, because we cannot be everything to every country. And I would hope that there is some systematic view of where do we prioritize, what is important, where can we intervene effectively, and where does an intervention simply sort of pour bad money after bad.
Yeah, Ms. Hart, did you want to just comment, just generally speaking, on the opportunity we're presenting to the CCP? And I don't mean generally, I mean this week.
Sure. Basically, we've given Beijing a blank check and kneecapped the United States and the entire global pro-democracy movement. If you want to talk about PNG and their need for medicines, there is very clear pattern that during the COVID crisis, Beijing forced nations around the world to carry out its political edicts in exchange for COVID vaccines. I have no doubt that Beijing is already showing up in capitals where the United States is pulling back and saying, here is your HIV medicine, and guess what? Here's the 3 things you need to do for me today to get it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Schatz. Senator McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. What a great and sobering panel. Mr. Stoff, I'd like to start with you and talk about the CCP's IP theft and research security. I ran the Commerce Department's export controls about 20 years ago, and even then, there were warning signs of the CCP's infiltration. I remember giving a speech that talked about 90% of Chinese software being stolen or acquired mostly from the United States. Here we are 2 decades later, and that risk seems more extreme and pervasive than ever. And when it comes to the CCP theft of U.S. research and IP, where are we most vulnerable? And are research security requirements for sensitive dual-use technologies, in particular, keeping up?
Thank you for the question, Senator. First, I think we need to understand and frame the current regulatory landscape that we operate in. Where we're most vulnerable is in fundamental research domains as defined by National Security Decision Directive 189. And basically, as you probably know, Senator, export controls largely do not apply in any case to any academic research that is designated as fundamental. And so that means that outside of a couple appropriations restrictions that have been put in place, particularly the NASA, the Wolf Amendment, there really actually isn't any restriction of any kind. And so this allows basically just a free, and this was set up by design, but this has become a much bigger problem. And I think the problem that you're raising goes beyond how we traditionally define and view IP theft, at least with the way our legal statutes are designed. Particularly 1831 and 1832 of the criminal code have very specific requirements to prove that it's theft. And most of the time, a lot of what's happening in academia, because of the open nature of our system, is not actually theft the way our statutes define it. And as such, the entire early stage of our research and innovation ecosystem is basically rife for complete penetration, influence, and diversion of all of that technology and research for China's benefit. And as was pointed earlier, I think Chairman Risch had mentioned, and when China comes in with lots of money, this is irresistible. And the combination of those two things make it very difficult for U.S. policy to affect change because they're just simply, originally by design, enough regulatory oversight to do anything about it. Quickly, I would say that, and in my recommendations, my written testimony, I do think that we need to apply some of the restrictions in our export control regimes. The entity list or BIS has, the OFAC lists, those are already established. Those have already, the U.S. government has already determined that there are a number of entities, both research institutions and companies that conduct research, that are a threat to our national security. Well, we should put restrictions in place if you're dealing with those entities because the government has already decided that those entities are a problem. So kind of harmonizing our export control regime with our ecosystem will help.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Along those same lines, in December, the Biden administration signed a 5-year extension of the U.S.-China Science and Technology Agreement. Was this a good idea? Is this part of the big gap in our regulatory framework that you're referring to?
To be honest, Senator, I am not familiar enough with the details of that agreement to opine on whether this is effective or not. But the sense I get is most of the policy apparatus and how universities and the government interacts with each other, grant-making agencies, et cetera, the things that I recommend, I don't think would have any bearing or effect on this larger government-to-government science technology agreement. I think there's all the things that I recommend would not necessarily conflict with that agreement.
Thank you. Mr. Mattis, just very quickly, we saw all the announcements this week around DeepSeek, R1. Does the proliferation of open source AI models that are trained to push the CCP's propaganda advance the party's efforts to shape public discourse in the United States? And how can this open source approach enable future influence operations?
So very quickly, I think there are two dangers of platforms like this from coming out of the PRC. The first is that it is a data collection effort, that the more people interact with these systems, the more that is brought in. And this is something that is, goes back to sort of the back-end software that are on Huawei, telecommunications and conference equipment, many other areas where you can see the PRC putting things kind of astride those pipes and platforms that allow them to benefit from the flow of information. So that's the other piece. The second is that the more that those models are trained on an international set of data, the more we're able to see things like the effectiveness of automated disinformation systems or propaganda systems that we have seen the PRC use. And the better those are, the harder it is to deal with, the harder it is to recognize them, the harder it is to shut it off.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Coons has yielded to Senator Kaine, as I understand it. Senator Kaine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to my Delaware colleague, Senator Coons. Thank you for being here. I'm interested in all of this topic. I'm particularly interested in Chinese influence in the Americas. I have maintained during my now 12-plus years here under presidents of both parties and under Senates controlled by both parties that we don't spend enough time or attention in the military space through Southcom or in the foreign assistance space. We're not focusing enough in the Americas. And China sees that as a huge opportunity area for them. And my other colleagues who travel in the Americas, we see this all the time. Investments in Panama, offers of, 5G systems to nations like Costa Rica. And we appropriately warn allies in the region about the dangers of these. And we usually hear the same thing. Yeah, we understand, but do you guys have anything on the table for us? And what we tend to say then is we kind of diplomatically stumble over our tongues because we don't really invest. I'm very nervous about a recent statement of President Trump's reported last week. We don't need Latin America. That was widely reported. And then the foreign aid pause last week, which didn't just affect programs in Latin America, it affected them everywhere. But even setting those things aside, talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of Chinese influence in the Americas and how worried we ought to be about it.
So the Americas is currently our primary battleground with Beijing. China sees our weaknesses there. They see an opening. They're showing up across the hemisphere. I think the recent port opened in Peru is a perfect example. When we show up, we win. And one example, I would like to thank Congress and this committee for authorizing and appropriating the CHIPS Act, which included $500 million for the State Department to show up in Latin America and elsewhere and partner with nations to support U.S.-based semiconductor manufacturing.
And just to use as an example, there was a chips plant in Costa Rica that had closed, relocated to China, but it is now back up and running in Costa Rica. And the CHIPS portion of the CHIPS Act that involved incentives for allied nations to produce chips near shore, if not onshore, was a factor in that decision.
And I would also like to add that that was a factor in Costa Rica saying no to Huawei and going with Western alternatives, because you cannot be a CHIPS recipient and have Huawei as your 5G provider. I'm quite confident that this committee would rule as such. And I would be remiss in my duty if I didn't add there is a substantial amount of counter PRC malign influence activities across the hemisphere that is currently frozen.
Please, Dr. Lind.
Thanks so much. It's a really important question and important to remind us of how vital the Latin American region is and is going to be in coming years. We are in a superpower competition. And we remember the last superpower competition that we were in, the number of times that the United States was engaged in various activities in Latin America, the number of times the Soviets were. I mean, think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? So just the fact that we are in a superpower competition again should cue us to be thinking that South America, South America is going to play a much larger role. I would say that China in particular is already, from its perspective, it sees the United States as very much operating in its backyard. And we have bases there, we have strong alliances, we have US military flowing throughout the region and so on. So China has the perception that it wants to push the US out, and a very keen way to do that, a very clever way to do that, is to start pressuring us in our backyard, as indeed it's already doing.
What's the Chinese assessment of our response? I mean, they are pushing in our backyard, but to me it doesn't look like we're really responding in a forceful way. Is that how China sees it?
I couldn't tell you how China sees it, unfortunately, but I think that when China looks at our efforts, it sees both a very powerful adversary, capable, technologically advanced, and adversary that has tremendous assets around the globe and tremendous goodwill across the globe and in the region that we're talking about in many ways. So China sees that, but it also sees vulnerabilities. And the vulnerabilities are many of which we've been pointing out today. And the vulnerability of the pause in foreign aid, for example, that's a...
Or refusal to confirm ambassadors in the region. These are all kind of part of a fabric. My time is over, so I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Scott.
Sure. Thank you, Chairman. Let me continue with what Senator Kane was talking about. I'm from Florida, so what goes on in Latin America is a big deal. We have a lot of people in my state that came from Latin America, and so they're following what's going on down there. And not just for sure the last 4 years, but for quite a while, the United States has not put a lot of effort into what goes on in Latin America. And as we've seen, whether it's Russia, China, even Iran, they have actions down there. So it's been frustrating to get the administrations to really focus on what's going on in Latin America. And hopefully the next 4 years with Marco Rubio as the Secretary of State and Michael Waltz, because he's from Florida and cares about it as National Security Advisor, we're going to see a change. Hopefully that's what will happen. I don't believe China is our friend. I believe their government, China, is clearly decided to be our enemy. They want to destroy our way of life. And I think if we don't wake up, it's going to be too late. Mr. Mattis, in 2021, you wrote a piece in War on the Rocks explaining Communist China's long-term strategy and ambition. Given that it's now 2025, 4 for your sense, has your interpretation changed of Xi Jinping's emphasis on the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation?
I would say, if anything, my appreciation for the clarity and long-term thinking of the CCP and its focus on these objectives has, I would say, gotten sharper than I put in that piece.
You think their ambitions are regional or global?
They're global. They've always been global. I mean, if you look at the way that Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, he was not talking about China becoming, or the PRC becoming the world's, or the Asia's largest steel producer. He was talking about it becoming the world's largest steel producer. And you can see from every leader, from the CCP's beginning to the present, that they've always seen themselves on a world stage and not simply a regional one.
Mr. Mattis, the CCP has invested heavily in military capabilities to challenge U.S. influence in the Indo-Pacific. I had the opportunity to go to the Philippines last year, I think it was, to see what they're doing in the shoals down there. How should the United States respond to these developments to preserve the ability to operate in this region?
I mean, ultimately, this is a place where the tyranny of geography and time requires us to work with allies and partners, and it requires us to make a greater investment in the number of platforms and ships and planes and drones that can be able to operate over those kind of large geographical distances.
You know, there's been a lot written that China doesn't have the ability to execute, and so a lot of people say, "Oh, don't take them seriously because they're not very good at what they attempt to try to do." What do you has that hurt us? Do you think there's a thought process out there that they can't do what they're trying to do?
We have a logical fallacy in the way that we have analyzed the PRC, which is that we use what we think their capabilities are today to dismiss their ambitions for tomorrow. And when in 1993, when the new strategic military guidelines were set out by Jiang Zemin and talking about fighting this kind of precision warfare in an information-rich environment and being able to exploit that, it looked like science fiction for where the PLA was. No one's laughing now about where that is. And what I find troubling is that when you look at a lot of analysis of the shortcomings of the PLA, is that we are quoting them talking about themselves. I do not like that the PLA is a self-conscious and self-aware actor that is seeing its problems and trying to fix them. And they're talking about some of these problems in a way that we don't actually know what their level of capability is. So just to take an analogy and say we're talking about a gymnast. Every gymnast has some trouble with sticking the landing. But the difference with sticking the landing between a 13-year-old and with an Olympian medalist is a completely different physics problem, and it's something completely different. But it would still show up as there's trouble sticking the landing. We don't know where the PLA's actual capability in some of these things are.
So for each of you, do you buy Chinese products and services, and do you think Americans should? I can start with you, Dr. Lin. Do you buy Chinese products and services?
I think probably everything I'm wearing and carrying is probably from China, and I think that's the case for many people here.
Do you try not to?
No, not consciously.
Dr. Hart?
I have young kids, and so I pay a lot of attention to where things are made and what the quality is. And that means that we tend to buy more from the U.S., and that means, unfortunately, we pay more for it as well.
Mr. Stoff?
I echo Dr. Hart's. I make great pains to try to avoid when I can, but it's quite a big challenge. But I take efforts too. Yeah.
Mr. Mattis?
I'm in the same situation as Dr. Hart, and I think it's important to pay attention to what you buy and where it comes from. We shouldn't care more about where our coffee comes from than we care about where our T-shirt comes from.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to all four witnesses. And I apologize for my lateness in arriving to question. There is another confirmation. There's a confirmation going on in another committee. I'm particularly concerned about the possible expansion of China's influence, both at home and abroad, as a result of a freeze on our foreign assistance, and in particular the way it's being implemented and its cascading effect. There is nothing China wants to do more than limit the reach of our global influence, than to reinforce their impression that we're an unreliable partner with countries throughout the world, and particularly in the global south. And my concern is that we put our security, our economic, and our diplomatic interests in danger with an abrupt pause that puts a halt to actions to counter malign activity by the PRC, to advance democracy, to invest in infrastructure. Dr. Hart, you referenced in response to a question from Senator Kaine the importance of our showing up in the CHIPS Act. A bill that came out of this committee that President Trump signed into law, the BUILD Act, helped create the Development Finance Corporation. It's received robust funding and support from both President Trump, President Biden. I'm hopeful that that will be part of our efforts to engage in infrastructure and in showing our influence. In the previous decade, the Belt and Road Initiative spent more than $1 trillion on infrastructure projects to try and buy influence and curry favor for the PRC. But this suspension of our aid, so broadly implemented, actually won't save money because the cost of shutting down and restarting programs often exceeds the cost of a careful review and then pivoting to more effective delivery. And it may not be temporary. For many small contractors and organizations, many run by foreign nationals, they won't be around in 90 days. So I just want to ask you a few quick questions, if I could. Dr. Hart, how do you think the PRC would be viewing this pause in our foreign assistance? And what impact do you think it would have for our pro-democracy work, both the IRI, the International Republican Institute, and the NDI, the National Democratic Institute, to have a 90-day freeze on their spending that would require them to lay off their employees, their contractors, and cease all activity?
Thank you for the question. You know, Beijing is viewing this as a blank check to take the space that we are vacating to pursue their interests at America's expense. And frankly, this kneecaps the global human rights and pro-democracy movement. I can share that, frontline rights defenders and pro-democracy groups are closing their doors. NDI and IRI are shutting down globally. The U.S. has effectively abandoned the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement as the NGOs supporting that movement have all ground to a halt. We've basically put a blindfold over the global apparatus that we use to track Beijing's rights abuses and hold them accountable. This is a blank check, and I am quite sure Beijing will seek to cash it.
Mr. Stoff, one of the impacts of the domestic funding freeze was to put at question research, university research, medical research, research by literally tens of thousands of different doctors and scientists across the United States. It's been temporarily paused, but it may well come back. What's the impact in terms of our credibility domestically and globally to have a across-the-board pause in federal funding for research?
Well, I think just to echo Dr. Hart's comments, whenever we do things like that, that provides more opportunity for China to come in. And this is already a problem set in terms of Chinese money and influence in our research ecosystem that is not really systematically tracked or understood at all. And so if we're kind of stopping this effort, it does give China a lot more opportunity to come in, and it also may give the opportunity to message around the world to our allies and partners that, oh, well, China's got the money, China can support this R&D, that maybe the U.S. isn't as serious about it now. So that there can be secondary effects to this that we need to very carefully consider.
I will say I appreciate Secretary Rubio reinterpreting the initial guidance so that it is broader. As some of my colleagues have pointed out, the actual impact on the ground in terms of its impact, who's being laid off, what's being shut down, is broad and will echo. When an organization like Freedom House that has long enjoyed bipartisan support, that has long been on the front lines of advocating for human rights and democracy, shuts its doors, when the IRI and the NDI shut their doors, I think China advances and we recede. I think it's profoundly unwise. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Senator Brasso.
Well, thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mattis, if I could, for you, I want to talk about undersea cables. It's happening around the world, the threats and the sabotage. We know that on January 3rd, Taiwan's Coast Guard intercepted a Hong Kong-owned freighter after damage to an international undersea cable was reported. Taiwan alleges that the Chinese vessel cut the fiber optic cable by dragging its anchor across the seabed. It's not an isolated incident there. I think according to Taiwan's National Security Bureau, over the past 3 years, there have been 7 or 8 of these undersea cable disruptions. Most of the incidents can be held to the responsibility of vessels from China. We're also seeing it in the Baltic. Our NATO friends and allies have had increased patrols to protect critical infrastructure, felt to be related to Russia's activities in that area. So while cable damage isn't uncommon, heightened geopolitical tensions have raised suspicion of sabotage, and that's what I believe it is. So what's China attempting to accomplish through these efforts?
So if we're able to lay responsibility at Beijing's door, or in the and probably that they were cooperating with Moscow on some of these operations. I think we should understand these as trying to, right now, test the response time of different actors to see what they can do. How long does it take to become repaired? How, in some sense, I think this is an area where we should be looking at what is the state of the undersea cable industry, who repairs, who maintains, who can lay this cable, and what is the structure of their companies, what are those interactions, because this is probably an area to keep the PRC out. And then with respect to Taiwan specifically, it's a question of, can they isolate Taiwan? Can they cut it off from the rest of the world? Can they create what they would call an information blockade so that Taiwan cannot function, cannot interact?
So you get to detect, respond, and repair. And is there something technologically that can help us do that more actively or quickly? How can countries better protect their undersea communication infrastructure from this potential sabotage?
I'm honestly not sure what the technological solution is. I do know that this operates in kind of a legal lacunae in the way that international law functions, as you could see in the Baltic when countries were having trouble figuring out what is the justification to seize and search a vessel that had clearly done something.
Yeah, so which leads to say, what would be the role then of international organizations in investigating and trying to prevent these incidents?
I think it's a country level investigation. It's an international cooperation, and to the extent that there's any international organization that has a role, they should be involved. And I think it's an important recognition for us that we have to understand that such an investigation only works when that organization has the integrity of its own processes. And I think everyone here could give you an example of an international organization that has not kept that integrity, and it's led to problems.
Can I ask you a separate topic, which is IP protection? Because some of the nation's strategic advantages that we have here come from our innovation, our technology, as well as our research and development. And in about 2019, America's intellectual property was valued at almost $8 trillion. China poses, I believe, a serious threat to our businesses and our academic institutions. The Chinese Communist Party consistently steals intellectual property, patents, other data. 2018, Chinese intellectual property theft was estimated to cost our economy over $600 billion a year. No telling how much these numbers have gone up since then. Is there leverage that we have here in the United States to help deter that threat?
I think one of the most powerful tools that we have is to deny the PRC a market, because in some cases they're stealing the intellectual property, they're turning around, driving U.S. companies or other companies out of business, and then they're able to sell it on our market. And this is one of the key features that they need access to in the world. This is what allows them to have the overcapacity, is the sure knowledge that they can sell those products from sort of ill-gotten methods on a U.S. market, on a European market, and elsewhere.
And similar topic, are there things that we can do better here at home to safeguard our intellectual property and our research from China?
There are many things that could do, as Mr. Stoff alluded to. We have whole categories of research that are not covered. We do not necessarily rigorously enforce some of the reporting and guidelines that are there. And we don't necessarily require, for example, security training or awareness for people that are involved in potentially sensitive projects. I mean, we could go down a very, very long list of potential options.
And one last question, I'm running out of time. Can you talk about any recent actions by China? What we have seen in their use of tactics against Taiwan that have taught us about China's capabilities and objectives that we might not have known?
I think if you look at the military exercises that have been launched around Taiwan, that you see an ability to operate more ships and more planes with less of a lead-off time, which is sort of reducing our warning time, which when you think about the geography of East Asia, we have much further to go. A second thing is that the National Security Bureau and the Ministry of Justice Investigation Bureau have made a number of arrests recently exposing sort of networks of CCP agents that are actually there to stir up trouble, to be in place for sabotage, and in some cases to instigate violence. And this is something that has been there, but if they're making arrests, this is a change in the scope and scale of that problem inside Taiwan.
Thank you. Senator Sheen, did you have a comment?
I did. Senator Barrasso, I wanted to point out that the only U.S. company that makes undersea cables is Subcom in New Hampshire, and I would bet they'd be happy to come down and brief us on some of the challenges that Mr. Mattis identified and how they would encourage us to respond to those.
Thank you.
So I'm happy to help arrange that.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks.
I think, Senator Brassos, you pointed out a brand-new problem with China. I mean, we never heard of undersea cables being disrupted. Now, all of a sudden, we get one right after the other, and the finger always goes back to Moscow and China combining to do it. So somebody's going to have to hold them accountable somewhere. With that, Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for your testimony. I think you're hearing a common theme, at least from this side of the dais, that the Trump administration's freeze on security assistance and many other forms of assistance is a gift to Beijing. And I've been listening by C-SPAN, and I think it's fair to say that we would agree that if we want to compete with the PRC for influence, we need to make sure that countries have a clear alternative based on our values and our competitive advantage as a nation. You can't beat something with nothing. And we have to be a reliable partner. But this freeze, in which we don't know how long it's going to last, is already sending a terrible message to our partners around the world who are standing up for their country's sovereignty against China's influence campaign. These are civil society partners. It's also been noted that putting a hold and disrupting our security assistance sends a terrible message to our partners, whether they're Taiwan, Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, Pacific Island nations, others in the East Indo-Pacific region. These countries rely on that ongoing support, and cutting it off without notice and without a clear idea when it's going to resume clearly puts us falling into China's hands. Then there are the human rights defenders that people have talked about. We know about the PRC's transnational repression of dissidents and how it's expanded, reaching dozens of countries. Both the State Department and AID provide urgent life-saving assistance to human rights defenders. There's also the decision of the Trump administration to withdraw from the World Health Organization, which again is a space that China will be happy to fill the void. And we're also learning about this purge over at USAID, where dozens and dozens of civil servants who have qualifications in these areas are being summarily sent home, and sometimes with pay, contractors without pay. So I guess my question is, as I sort of listen to the testimony so far, Ms. Hart, is, and I know Senator Schatz asked a version of this question, but if you're President Xi, right, are you looking to exploit this moment? And what would you be doing to exploit the moment? And do you agree that what we've seen is really an unforced error and gift to President Xi and the PRC?
Absolutely. So first, I would like to acknowledge and thank Secretary Rubio for the measures he's taken thus far. I would hope to see them extended to cover other programs, including the counter-China programs. Basically, this across-the-board freeze has kneecapped America in the global competition with China. We've talked about how this silences and blindfolds our human rights watchers, giving Beijing a blank check to commit human rights abuses, including forced labor abuses. We've talked about, the Taiwan military, foreign military financing freeze, which gives Beijing a blank check to ramp up the coercion around Taiwan. There are two others I would like to mention. Cyber assistance is frozen. We are giving Beijing a blank check to commit cyber attacks against some of our partner nations. States CDP, the Cyberspace Digital Connectivity and Related Technology Fund, provides rapid foreign assistance to small countries that are being targeted with Chinese and Russian cyber attacks. That's turned off. Beijing has a golden opportunity to go after networks. And another one that hasn't been mentioned thus far is, with DFC over the past few years has been finally chipping in outbidding Chinese companies, even Chinese state-owned enterprises, in global infrastructure projects, including ports and telecom infrastructure. That is where we want to put Beijing on our back foot. But DFC is impacted by the freeze. And XM may not be directly impacted, but any company has to look at US financing vehicles. Any country has to look at XM and DFC and question how reliable they are. So it not just kneecaps us in human rights, in protecting Taiwan, in resisting cyber attacks, it also undercuts our ability to outbid Beijing in ports and telecom infrastructure.
Well, I appreciate that, and I know that there have been lots of discussions with Secretary Rubio, who was supported unanimously in the Senate. There's been some clarification on the humanitarian aid front, that it's not just limited to emergency food assistance, other areas, but the rest of this freeze is still in place. And you've described the really terrible consequences. So I hope we can end this sort of this forced error, our own goal here, and get back on track. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking member, it's great to be with you. Before I begin my remarks, it's important to me to lay down some foundational principles that I believe all of us operate on. And I'll just tell you personally, I have great respect for the Chinese people, the Chinese culture, the Chinese history. And I just want to make sure none of this morning is about any of that, but rather a dictatorship that is as hard on their own people as they are on other people. So let me jump in. Today I introduced a bill aimed at increasing pressure on Chinese, the way they address the theft of our IP. IP theft is one of the top issues I hear back about in my district, small businesses to big businesses across the top. And I understand it's estimated that we lose about $600 billion annually to this. So, Mr. Mattis, to what extent is China's IP theft explicitly backed by the government as a state-sponsored initiative? Is it actively pursued by the government as a strategy, or does the government simply turn a blind eye as long as it targets Americans?
It is a policy that is backed both by the party and the state, and that party and state organizations are both involved in actively organizing people to conduct that theft, in creating, for example, one of the latest innovations is overseas innovation centers to fund partnerships. And this is a constantly sort of morphing problem that we cut off one avenue and another one pops up. They are a creative and prolific adversary, if you will, in terms of finding the holes and trying to keep those things going, especially when they can exploit third countries that may not care as much about the protection of U.S. intellectual property and U.S. technology.
Thank you. Now, if I might, I'd actually like to speak to my CCP handlers. I know you're listening. I know you try to read my emails. I know you try to read my texts. I know you try to influence me back in my home state and my staff here in Washington, D.C. So I have a word for you. Jui Ting, it's not working. I'm not intimidated, and I will continue to fight for freedom and democracy around the world, especially in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Now, Mr. Mattis, can you help us describe a little bit what subnational influence operations are and the influence that targets people within a state, and how much of the goal is it to influence state and local government, and how much it is to try to influence federal officials?
Well, the answer of whether or not it's also to influence the federal government as well as state and local is yes, because I mean, I think how many people in this chamber and in the Senate at large, began their careers as town council members, as state legislators, and others, because there is a natural progression and a natural career path that people hold. And when you look at, the attempt that was widely reported at a House member in the Bay Area, right? They were targeting the Chinese consulate, was targeting a number of different politicians in that area. And in your home state of Utah, they've They have certainly looked for specific connections back to the PRC and looked for ways to shape government decisions. And one of the other things that you can see there is it can be regulatory. Some states required a change in their laws to allow a Confucius Institute at those universities, so that's occurred. You can see it in terms of trying to push government procurement so that PRC products, rather than from Huawei, from Lenovo, from others, rather than others that might be safer, are put into government. And I think anything that you can describe or that you have heard reported as being directed at a national government has been directed at a state and local. And the biggest difference is they lack access to the staff resources and oftentimes the knowledge to be able to push back effectively. Although I think your state has the most robust private sector in trying to identify and push back on these threats.
Yeah, good, thank you. I'd like to kind of end where I began and just double down on this. Like, my goal is that we have a strong, productive relationship with China. We don't need to be at odds, but it has to be a relationship that's on the equal. You can't steal our intellectual property. You can't take advantage of our businesses and expect us to have the type of relationship that we need to have for not just us, for them, and for the entire world. And so thank you all. Thank you for this hearing, and I yield my time.
Thank you, Senator Kerr. Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Chairman Risch, Ranking Member Shaheen, for holding today's important hearing. Thank you to all the witnesses for joining us today. With this administration's disastrous decision to freeze almost all foreign assistance, we all know this hearing is a critical opportunity for us to highlight not just China's harmful influence, but also the opening this freeze gives to the PRC to expand its foothold around the world, as many of my colleagues have already spoken about. We would be naive to think that desperate countries will not turn to China to fill the gaps that our assistance has left behind. And so with that in mind, I'm going to move on to my first question, which is PRC investment in the Middle East, because in recent years, China has deepened its ties with the Middle East. For example, the PRC has spent billions on projects in the region, including for infrastructure initiatives, such as high-speed rail line linking the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, desalinization, solar plants, port modernization projects. Meanwhile, the current administration's foreign assistance freeze, which already has broad-reaching impacts throughout the Middle East, threatens to leave a vacuum that the PRC can exploit for further influence in this critical region. So, Dr. Lind, what are the practical implications, practical effects of Chinese investment in the Middle East? Specifically, I'd like to hear more about how the PRC can leverage or might leverage its economic ties to advance its regional interests.
Thank you for this great question. So I think it's clear from Chinese activities in the Middle East that you describe that we can see in China and its behavior there, as well as other areas of the world, it does have global aims. It recognizes that this is an essential region for energy security, and for influence. And so China wants to have influence within that key region. So its actions tell us that pretty clearly. I think the other thing, getting to the practical implications of this, so obviously this is letting the United States know we need to be engaged in this region if we want to maintain the influence that we've had. And then also on the theme of today's hearing, I think this is a region where we particularly see the risk of China's support for global authoritarianism. China is probably the world leader in what we talk about technologies of authoritarian repression. And this is one realm in which it practices tremendous influence around the world. And in this region in particular, it's just, there's so much demand for what China is selling. And it's not, by that I don't mean just Chinese technologies. I mean certainly Chinese firms, but also Chinese government influence, Chinese government partnerships. These are relationships that it seems to be sort of pushing on an open door between like-minded societies in many ways that some of these governments have an interest in acquiring technologies and methods and expertise in repression, and China holds that expertise and technologies and so on. And so those are, I think, among the biggest practical implications of its involvement there.
Well, we have a lot of threats from China, the threat of countering the threat of opioids, countering the threat of other types of competition. But I'm going to move on to something in my last moment that has a Nevada connection. It's the lithium competition. Because given the dual-use potential economic importance of lithium-ion batteries, securing a reliable lithium supply, it's a national security imperative. Nevada's poised to be a global leader in this issue. We're home to the highest proven lithium reserves in the United States. So Dr. Hart, I'm concerned that Chinese battery exporters, we think about other ways they can influence us, and we all like our phones. You know, people know about lithium from that. That deliberately lowering the price of lithium-ion batteries to undercut U.S. and allied manufacturers. It's a tactic the PRC has employed in the past. So can you talk to us about how we can weather this unfair practice and ultimately win the lithium-ion battery race with China?
Sure. So where we have sectors that Beijing controls global supply chains, and we're working very hard to get alternatives online, such as the projects in Nevada, getting those alternatives online is step one. Step two, I suspect we're going to need something like a buyer's club for these critical products, whereby the United States and key allies and partners agree to buy from each other, recognizing that we won't cut each other off. Otherwise, if we have a completely open market, China will do what China has done before, which is dump product on the market to put these really important alternatives out of business. So getting them online is step one. But for step two, we're going to have some kind of multilateral arrangements or buyers clubs to encourage and incentivize companies to buy from Nevada instead of buying from Beijing.
And would you think it's a good idea for the Department of Energy and the Department of Commerce to continue to fund the lithium loop that is in Nevada as a tech hub that will help us fight China?
I think our national security may depend on it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank our panel. Dr. Lin, as we closed here, you hit on a point that I think really deserves underscoring, and that is the fact between our cultures. And that is, you were talking about the technology they produce for really controlling populations. And there is a real difference between autocracies and democracies in that here we in the United States and other democracies, we the people want to control our government, and those autocracies are in the exact opposite business, and they have a government that wants to control their people. And it is a very, very different view of life from the time you get up in the morning till the time you go to bed at night. And that's the world we live in, and we're going to have to figure out how we continue to live in a world where we have such differences in our view of the importance of an individual human being. So with that, thank you for the panel. This has been a great panel that we've heard from today. We hear a lot of them over the years. That we have probably as good an expertise here as I've seen on any issue that we have. So thank you all for participating today. I'm going to leave the record open for 24 hours to submit questions for the record. If we have some, I hope you'll take the opportunity to include answers to those in the record. So with that, Ranking Member, any final thoughts? Or thank you.
Just thank you to all of you.
Thank you so much. With that, the hearing is adjourned.